There are many ways to attempt to win a modern war. Some are very effective, others not so much. There is one method that has worked time and time again, that being a massive naval blockade. So, to preface this a little, let's go back, way back to 1900, and the start of the German-British naval arms race. This is going to be important to understand for where we will end up on this journey of knowledge. Germany and Britain had long since been rivals, but because of restructuring power spheres on the continent, the pressure was on for Germany to develop its own naval fleet, now being surrounded by two massive empires, including from the north. The German Navy up to this point was fast and modern, but it paled in comparison to the rest of the industrialized nations. Because of this, Germany embarked on a massive naval buildup, hoping, in the case of war, to be able to demand concessions from the British. So Willie II got down to work with his top admiral, Alfred von Tirpitz, on creating what's known as a fleet in being. I'd go into this, but this video is already long as it is, and I don't have time for a really long tangent right now. This action, undertaken by the Germans in 1897, practically forced the hand of the British not to give up on their own naval supremacy and made it so they had no choice but to ramp up their own production of ships. So I think you can see where this is going, to a massive overbloated arms race that lasted about 14 years. Why this is significant is because it gave us one of the most important pieces of technology ever created, the HMS Dreadnought. Once this sexy beast hit the scene, it was such a game changer that all the ships that came before it became known as pre-dreadnoughts, and everything after as post-dreadnoughts or dreadnoughts. Again, I could go into the specifics of this whole thing, but that's not what we are here for. We are here to focus on the major development in the German Navy at the time, so we need to stay focused or we will lose sight of that goal. So it's 1906. The British just launched the world's most advanced, cheapest to build, built faster than anything you've ever seen, less complex, and mechanically superior to anything you've ever seen before. What's a German admiral to do? Copy it, of course! It's what everybody did! But this was extremely costly, and took a long time to get onto the levels with which the British could produce ships. So as of 1909, Germany had the world's second largest navy and Europe's largest army. This was getting expensive, so they shifted focus. They knew that they could not abandon the idea of naval supremacy over the British, for if they did get into a war with them, they were aware that the UK would use their overwhelming might at sea to overpower and destroy any attempt at securing overseas holdings that the Germans had. They needed to shift gears immensely. They realized that maintaining a surface fleet was important, so they did, but they also looked at a subsurface alternative too. They realized that if they switched to a strategy of commerce raiding with submarines, they could hopefully choke off Britain and France should a war arise with them. And thus was born the idea of German submarine warfare. No! That's not for another 30 years. Ah, there she is. So when the war kicked off in 1914, Britain did exactly what everyone with a brain knew they would do. They placed Germany under a massive blockade. With their 29 dreadnoughts against Germany's... No, this can't be right. Okay, Germany's 17. Let's add France's 10 to Britain's total, and I can see why Germany was so scared. This cannot have ended well for Germany. I know some of you may be thinking, how bad can a naval blockade really be? Well, you see, you nosy little shit. I'll answer your question a little later. The only clash of these two surface giants was at the Battle of Jutland, not Jutland, Jutland, which lasted from May 31st to the 1st of June 1916. There was no clear winner, though the British did destroy enough of the German surface fleet that they felt they could no longer risk going out to challenge the Royal Navy. As I said before, this was no longer the priority for the German Imperial Navy, however. They now used their U-boats that lurked under the waves to raid the British commerce shipping. The Germans were responding in kind to the English blockade. They were also not afraid to go after military targets, sinking many British ships early in the war. The submarines were extremely effective for the primitive technology and made significant gains against what seemed overwhelming odds. The main advantage of a U-boat is simply that it could submerge under the water. While submerged, they were effectively undetectable to ships at the time. Now, even if a surface vessel spotted their stalking submarine, there's nothing they could do about it. Early on in the war, there were no countermeasures against submarines, and submarine raiding would go unchecked. It was only in 1916, when depth charges became viable, that surface vessels had a competent response to submarine raiding. So for 2 years, there was no protection or countermeasures against a submerged submarine. The only ways to fight back was to catch it on the surface and gun it down, or wait for it to be at a higher depth and ram it. Now, of course, these two situations are not ideal or practical. I know what I said before, but Germany was hesitant to actually allow their U-boat captains to attack merchant shipping, due to the strain it could cause with non-aligned nations such as Spain, or more importantly, the United States. Once the order was lifted allowing the subs to attack commerce, they got down to business and wasted no time attempting to make up for the amount of damage that the British blockade was doing to their country. The problem is that the U-boats were not as efficient as the British surface raiders, so they could not hope to have the same kind of effect. Now, this has all been a build-up to this point in the video. The blockade to Germany was devastating, and at the same time they were perfecting their submarine technology. Though, even with it, they could not break the blockade. So what's a resourceful country to do? Go under it, of course. They thought with their superior submarine technology, they could go underneath the blockade and continue trading with the United States. They weren't totally wrong. By doing this, they managed to circumnavigate the Royal Navy and avoid the blockade altogether. The solution came from the private sector rather than the Navy. The Deutsches Ozeanreederei, I know I botched that one, I'm an idiot, was the firm that proposed the construction of 7 merchant submarines. Their goal was to keep the country going with continuous trips to the US and the rest of the world, carrying about 750 tons of cargo both ways. This is not a lot, considering that vessels of this time could carry between 6,000 and 10,000 tons, and in some cases more. Most importantly here, the German people needed well beyond that to prevent starvation. On her first voyage, she arrived in Baltimore on July 9, 1916. It carried 125 tons of chemical dyes and alizarin derivatives in a highly concentrated form. For its return trip, she carried 341 tons of nickel, 93 tons of tin, and 348 tons of crude rubber. Her cargo was valued around $17.5 million, which was far more than the ship's construction cost. The arrival of a German submarine in the US was not something that the people in New England overlooked, and had a similar reaction as you. They took it as a shock, and we can see some of these reactions in an article that was published on July 10, 1916 from the Baltimore Sun. The reporters attempted to conduct an interview to which the German crew was impatient and ended up just steaming away from the shore. You know, as real sailors do. I understand why they would be so annoyed. They just survived a trip across the Atlantic, mostly under the waves, and are now looking at heading back into the hostile environment. I don't blame them for being gruff with the media. This was the first successful blockade run by a merchant submarine, and it inspired a second supply run. The second trip was to New London in Connecticut with $10 million in cargo. In 2019 terms, that's $230,240,000. This journey was to be her last merchant voyage and would be very eventful. She entered New London in November 1916 and offloaded her cargo that included gems, securities, and medicinal products. On her way home, now loaded with 6.5 tons of silver bullion, the fun began. The 17th of November would see disaster strike. Not for the sub, but for the poor unsuspecting tugboat that steamed in front of it. The tugboat T.A. Scott Jr., what a name, turned suddenly in the path of the submarine and was struck. The tug sank immediately, taking all 5 men who were on board with her. Deutschland was badly damaged and had to return to port for massive repairs. It delayed her departure by a week, but on the 21st of November, 1916, she departed for Germany. Upon her return, Captain Paul Koenig penned a novel about the journeys of his submarine. The book is titled Voyage of the Deutschland, the first merchant submarine. This book was used as an attempt at propaganda. It was used to sway public opinion in both Germany and the United States. Unfortunately, the ship would make only 2 supply voyages before being transferred to the Navy. A third trip was planned, but was never carried out before the government decided that relations between Germany and the US had become too negative to continue with its intended mission. On the 19th of February, 1917, she was formally transferred to the German Imperial Navy and converted into U-155, undergoing a refit that fitted her with 6 bow torpedo tubes with 18 torpedoes. Fitted to her deck were 2 15-centimeter SKL-40 naval guns, taken from the pre-dreadnought battleship SMS Zahergin. The ship was a successful merchant raider from this moment on, making many voyages out into the Atlantic. The Deutschland, or U-155, would make 3 successful raiding trips and sink 42 ships, from the summer of 1917 to the end of the war. At the closing of hostilities, the Deutschland would be surrendered to the British. In typical English fashion, they paraded it around as a war trophy for a few years before it was eventually sold for scrap in 1921. Now, is this where the story of this interesting submarine ends? Not really. It wouldn't be on this channel if it was. She inspired other craft that the Italians would use in the Second World War that were submarine cargo and transport ships for troops. But for the Deutschland, in her final hours, this legendary ship was sitting in the process of being cut down when she suffered an unexplained explosion that killed 5 apprentices. It seems as though the Deutschland would not go quietly into the night.